The Edmonton Oilers have gotten off to slow starts in each of the last two regular seasons. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, surely it can't happen again, right?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This upcoming October will be my 10th season doing digital hockey content and my 4th as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network. And I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win up to $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to talk about the slow starts the Oilers have gotten off to each of the last two seasons. Our opening segment, we will break down the historical context of the first 15 games or so of the 2023-2024 season, 2024-2025. In our second segment, we will pivot to talking about why this upcoming season should be different. And then in our third segment, we'll take the 10,000-foot view. How the first month of the season goes is going to tell us a lot about the direction of the team, not just in the present, but where it's going to go rest of the year and into the future. So to start out, as you all know, and if you're new here, if you're not an everydayer, I am a history nerd. If you go through the various bookshelves in my room, like right, for instance, these are just 4 books I have sitting on the floor next to my desk because I don't have room. I have a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I have a book about Bo Jackson. I have Normal People by Sally Rooney. And then I have a sociological book about tourism. I am constantly reading nonfiction. I am constantly trying to learn more. I am a proponent and a believer that you need to know your history because history does not repeat itself, but it operates in cycles. It echoes. And historical context is very valuable when we have a lot of data. An example, talking about the trend line of power plays called in the league, in the NHL at large. That is important context because it tells us something about the way the game is being played in a given season. Because if penalties trend upward for several seasons in a row and then pivot and start going down again, that tells us something has changed in the way games are officiated and the way games are played because the players have adapted to the new rules or the way the game is being called. At least it is forcing something different. It is changing behavior. And I look at it through this lens because I think there is stuff to glean. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Oilers have gotten off to slow starts each of the last 2 years. I think a lot of what makes those things happen, what makes a slow start, starts the year before. And obviously last year, coming off a Stanley Cup Final, losing in the most heartbreaking fashion possible after almost pulling off the greatest comeback in the history of professional sports, it's okay. I understand why and thought it was pretty reasonable that they came out of the gate really clunky last year. So I'm going to click on over to my notes here so I can read the stats and put them in the proper context for you. So last year, the Oilers go 7-7-1 out of the gate. They're outscored 40-48. If you'll recall, they got shut out badly on opening night by the Jets. Through those first 15 games, their power play was converting at 16%. Their penalty to kill was killing off 59% of opponent power plays. They were doing that with .902 goaltending. So I think that should tell you when you're talking about power play, you're talking about special teams, those are execution problems. Those are detail problems. Because while the personnel was a bit ambiguous to start the year on the penalty kill, there were a lot of new faces last year, which I think was, in addition to the emotional hangover, part of the conversation. You replace Dylan Holloway, you replace Ryan McLeod, and you put in Jeff Skinner, you put in Victor Arvidsson, Noah Vander Kane, you fully transition Ryan Nugent-Hopkins to wing. You're trying to figure out what you're going to do with Corey Perry. And when you have that much roster turnover, it's pretty normal for things to be funky. Hockey is such an intuition and feel-based sport. So much of the decision making, so much of the challenges about the game come down to how a player reads a situation. And no two players are going to read a situation exactly the same. Yes, you have structures. You're going to try and defer to that structure so everybody has a loose idea of what's going on. But for the most part, this comes down to decision making. This comes down to one person making a play. And when it starts to snowball the way it can and the way it did for the Oilers the first month or so of the season, each of the last 2 years, that's where it starts to feel like everything that can go wrong does go wrong. This is a team that is veteran laden. And this is a team that, again, experienced turnover coming out of last year into this upcoming season that's going to start in a couple of weeks. But for me, the start of the season, the tone is set earlier than that. I point to Darnell Nurse only participating in the last 2 preseason games last year and starting the year looking like he did not know how to play organized hockey because he did not have a training camp. Think about what Jeremy Swayman looked like last year for the Bruins after working out on his own all offseason and then showing up the day the season started for his first game action. Jeremy Swayman had a brutal year last year because he didn't have a training camp. He didn't have a preseason. The results of the preseason, the counting stats, none of that really matters. The preseason is just a really intense workout to get your guys ramped up for the start of the actual games. And that's the key to understanding this. You want to get your feet under you, you want to get your cardio good, and you want to get mentally prepared. And then real quick, as an aside, I think 23-24, extreme outlier. You have Connor McDavid, who says, I worked out too hard in the offseason. I came into the season a little worn down. He got hurt early in October. Matthias Ekholm was dealing with a nagging injury in early October of 2023 as well. You got to remember they started the season with the international games abroad, came back stateside. They were dealing with a litany of injuries. Their special teams weren't awful. I'm clicking back over to my notes. In 23-24, they had a 23% power play, a 70% penalty kill. They came 2-9-1 out of the gate. They were outscored 50-31. I think a lot of that is chalked up to Ekholm being limited in his capacity to play well. And I think you saw a microcosm of that in the Stanley Cup Final last year. This is a really important player to the team's trajectory. This is a really important player to what this team wants to do, both in terms of execution and in terms of style. So if you're dealing with guys like Ekholm and Nurse, who play crucial roles, not just at even strength, they're both on the penalty kill as well, dealing with injuries where they don't have a great feel, where they were limited in the preseason. And so much of penalty killing is read and react. It's having your instincts sharp as possible, trying to jump routes, trying to jump passes. And when you're dealing with injuries, that becomes more challenging. And when that penalty kill is just getting thumped over and over and over again, you start to walk on eggshells out there. You start to play less intense defense because you don't want to take a penalty, because you know the penalty kill's having a hard time. So you have to play a little bit weaker defense because you can't risk taking a penalty. A lot of these behaviors, a lot of these habits are environmental, where based on how something is going, you're going to have a certain reaction. But we're going to take our first break here on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when I come back, I'm going to tell you why it should be different this time and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Because right now, new FanDuel customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use on the FanDuel app. I love using FanDuel because however you want to play, FanDuel makes it happen. If you don't want to bet the game, they have player props. If you want to cook something up with your friends, maybe a squad ride, same game parlays. Or if you have a feel as the game's going or coming down to that big final moment, live action makes it happen. Tonight, we've got a decent NFC West game, Cardinals and Seahawks, Seattle going down to Arizona, where the Seahawks are 1.5-point road favorites. Good game in the NFC. The Eagles, 3.5-point road favorites at the Buccaneers, who are also undefeated. The Chargers against Jackson Dart in his starting debut. The Chargers, 6.5-point road favorites at MetLife. And then fun one, Sunday afternoon, Lamar and the Ravens going to Kansas City to take on Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. The Ravens, 2.5-point favorites at Arrowhead. That's crazy. So, FanDuel has one question. Are you ready? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet for a chance at $300 in bonus bets. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are making our way through the week. Preseason underway. Yes, I still have that slight cold. If my voice is irritating or slightly off, I know, I hear it myself. It's driving me crazy, but hopefully another day or two and I'll be breathing normally out of both nostrils and my throat won't be as scratchy and we'll be back in business. But this time of year is one of the best because the season hasn't started yet, and there's a lot of hope out there right now. Not in all 32 camps. I would say of the 32 teams in the NHL, there are probably about 15 or so that have hope. There are another 10 or so that think, okay, maybe if things go well for us this year, we can make some noise. We sneak in. And then there are like 5 or 6 teams who know their season's going to end that second week of April and are already looking towards their Cancun trip at the end of April or early May with their girlfriend and a couple of their teammates. If you're on the Blackhawks, the Sharks, the Predators, the Islanders, the Penguins, the Kraken, if you're one of those teams where you're probably not making the playoffs, it's different. But for everybody else, right now is where you start mentally preparing yourself for the grind. Because as we talk about all the time here on Locked On Oilers, the NHL season is ludicrously long. If you go all the way to the Stanley Cup Final, you're effectively getting an 8-week vacation and that's it. If you get to a game 6, 7, even a game 5 of a Stanley Cup Final and your season ends June 20th, even the 18th, okay, you got a week in June, you got July, you got August. Second week of September, you're back in town. You're not doing team-affiliated stuff, but you're in town. You're probably hanging out with the guys. You're probably doing a couple informal workouts just to get your feet under you. I know we're getting rid of preseason fitness testing next year, but you still had to do your fitness testing this year. You've got 60 people in training camp for 20 roster spots. And look, we know the vast majority of the guys who are here are grinding their butts off to look good, to potentially be a call-up. These are guys who are trying to fill out the AHL roster. But by and large, your mental grind to eventually lift the best trophy in sports, that starts now. And that feels so far away. And it is. You got all of October, November, December, January, February, March, and then April, 2 weeks of April. Then you still have 2 more weeks in April, all of May, and 2 to 3 weeks in June. That's what it takes to get this done. And that's why I am still, and I always have been, a strong proponent of getting off to a good start. Obviously, everybody knows that. It is not great wisdom. It is not, oh, wow, Nick, no. Everybody wants to get off to a good start. You get your feet under you, you build a cushion, you buy yourself time. The Oilers, each of the last 2 years, came out of the gates varying degrees of bad. 2 years ago, unconscionable. It got the coach fired. The Oilers came out of the gate so bad in 2023, it got Jay Woodcroft fired. Last year, Chris Knoblauch wasn't going to get fired 15 games into the season. But the special teams units were a disaster through the first month of the season. They were not scoring at 5-on-5. The team looked downright cooked. But McDavid gets injured end of October. They kind of snap into gear. They played their best hockey last year, if you recall, from the midway point of December, or even earlier than that, even early December. That game they played against the Rangers, where the Rangers were in Edmonton, that really kind of got them going on the roll they went on. And then through the end of January, the Oilers had the second best points percentage in the NHL from, I think it was November 21st through the end of January. They were one of the best teams in the league for that 2-month stretch. And that point cushion afforded them breathing room to stink it up down the stretch. And make no bones about it, the Oilers were bad in March and April. The Oilers were actively bad. After the Four Nations face-off, the Oilers were an actively bad hockey team. Now, fairness, they were very injured, and they had guys who could have played if the games mattered, but the Oilers were more predisposed to worrying about the postseason. And much to their credit, and at the time, I did not give them enough credit for this. I was actually pretty worried going into that Kings series. You want to be building momentum your season. And a season-long momentum is not linear. Nobody goes 82-0, but you win 3 out of every 5, 4 out of every 6 or 7 for a month or two. You start to get your feet under you. You start to know what you can get away with. You start to know what it's going to take. And your goal as the season goes along needs to be raising that baseline every few weeks. And they're going to be ups, they're going to be downs, but your goal as an NHL team that has Stanley Cup aspirations is the team that gets off the bus that first day of October keeps getting a little bit better. And that's not necessarily the team in the aggregate. And I was reading an article about this, about the Mets actually yesterday in The Athletic. I forget the word it was called, but the way there was a statistic they were describing to account for everybody playing well or bad at the same time. And that's not what we're saying here. We know that more often than not that some guys are going to be having good nights and other guys won't. That's just the nature of variance. That's the nature of life. Some people have stuff, some people don't. Now, there are things you can do to mitigate that. There are things you can do to make it better. But for the most part, there are going to be games where some guys have a good game, some guys have a bad game. And your hope is that those are staggered and don't all come at the same time. So that way you can account for when guys have bad nights because – and I forget what team I was talking about, but your goal, and this is not an actual like metric, but every player on your team should have at least one moment during an 82-game regular season. I'm not saying they score an overtime game winner or they have a 50-save shutout, but there should be at least one game for each of those guys in your lineup where you're like, man, Trent Frederick was really good tonight. I'm happy for him. Wow, Podkolzin, what a game from that guy. Stuart Skinner, what a game from that guy. Because if each guy on your team has at least one of those, that tells you have a pretty well-rounded team. And that's why it matters. It's not so much when the performances come, it's that every now and then somebody you're not expecting has the opportunity to make something happen, not just for them, but by transitive property for the entire team. And the season is so long. You need to have depth. And then the other part of that depth conversation comes in the postseason. And look, I don't think performance in October is necessarily indicative of what's going to happen down the road, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the Oilers have gotten off to pretty poor starts out of the gate and then responded with some blistering runs. If you'll recall, when Jay Woodcroft got fired, they lost the first few games of Chris Knoblauch, and then they rattled off 15 in a row. When you are dialed in, good things happen. You know, the Murphy's Law trope about anything that bad can happen will happen. The other end of that goes too. When you're having your night, guys can get stupid goals to go in. Goalies can make accidental saves. Your goal, and I'll quote every Little League coach I ever had in saying this, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You are in the right place at the right time. You work your butt off. You practice those situations. So not only physically, but mentally, you can go out there and you can execute. We are going to take our second and final break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to tell you why this first month of the season matters more for the narrative than the team's actual results right after this. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are inching closer to the start of the 2025-2026 NHL season. And friends, it's on the horizon. Preseason camp is moving along. Guys are going to start to get cut. Guys are going to start getting sent to AHL camp. And the Oilers know what it's going to come down to this year. We've been talking about it all summer. It might not be fair, but the expectation is it's do or die now. If you go to the Athletics life cycle column where they ranked all 32 teams based on where they were in their contender cycle from win right now to starting over, and the Oilers are number 2 behind the Stars in win right now. That is based on where they have been, what their recent trajectory is, and what the long-term prospects of their roster are. And we talked about it a little bit yesterday on the Vasily Podkolzin extension episode. The Oilers are indeterminate into the future, at least until McDavid signs. If McDavid signs a 3 or 4 year deal, you have him, Bouchard, Draisaitl. You can figure out the rest. And look, I'm not saying it's easy to assemble an NHL roster. It's not. I can personally tell you it's not. Even though I've never been a GM, I know it's a lot easier, a lot more difficult than just picking good players. But you have those three as a baseline. You're going to be able to hang around. And your goal as a general manager is not to hang around. It is to consistently make the playoffs. It is consistently get to conference finals and Stanley Cup finals. This takes time. My everydayers have heard me talk about this for a year and a half now that I've been hosting the show. The Lightning won a Stanley Cup 12 years after drafting Steven Stamkos. The Avalanche won a cup 8 years after drafting Nathan MacKinnon. The Golden Knights 7 years after coming into existence. This takes time. The Panthers more than 10 years after drafting Sasha Barkov. This takes time. Now, the Oilers are definitely getting to the end of this life cycle. And we've talked about that quite a bit. You know, is Jake Wallman your Ekholm replacement? Who are you going to line up to be the Hyman and Nuge replacements? Is that as simple as just Ike Howard and Matthew Savoie? And you just need to find the new Ike Howard and Matthew Savoie? Because that's more doable. And that's really the key here. Can you start to get making progress? And yes, one of the realities of being a decision maker in professional sports is you have to weigh the present versus the future. Because if you go too aggressively in the present, you will not be the one who gets to fix the mistakes. If you go too aggressively in the short term, eventually that bill comes due. Eventually, you need to start making things happen for yourself. And that's one of the real conundrums we get to in sports is where the general manager acts out of self-interest when they are signing expensive free agents, when they are trading draft picks. You never want to be acting in your self-interest because the minute you start to act in your own self-interest as a general manager, that's where you run into issues. When you start managing for yourself, you go into business for yourself, like we talk about in professional wrestling, somebody who's not in on the book. That's where the organization gets screwed over, because if you burn all your draft picks, you burn all your draft picks, you burn all your prospects, and you overpay for some depth forwards, you know, very much like what Chris Drury has done with the Rangers. The guy who has to fix this mess will not be Chris Drury, because it's going to get to a point where the Rangers are built around Trocheck, Zibanejad, Alexis Lafreniere, JT Miller, Adam Fox, and Igor Shesterkin. That's not bad. The problem is those guys have to be the best players on their team, and it is almost impossible to win in today's NHL with your goalie and your number one goalie and your best defenseman being your two best players. I would venture to say that hasn't happened in recent NHL history. If you look through, no, you make 3 or 4 guys, 5 guys even, who might be better than Gus Forsling or Sergei Bobrovsky on the Panthers. You go to the Avs, probably 2 or 3 guys better than Darcy Kemper when they won the cup, but I'll give you Cale Makar as their second best player behind McKinnon, sure. Vegas, okay. Eichel, great. Pietrangelo, maybe, but Aiden Hill's not their third best player, and that's what I'm talking about here. The Oilers have yet to show proof of concept to go all the way. They have enough that they have been close twice now. That's not nothing. That is not insignificant. And I do want to reiterate that. I've held that posture a lot more in June when the wound was fresh each of the last 2 years, that you have to be able to take some things away from that. You have to be able to learn. You have to be able to try and improve. And I felt last summer, Jeff Jackson looked at their problems against the Panthers and said, we didn't score enough. Our defense didn't let us down. We just got outlasted. We didn't score enough. So Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner, more established, more proven than Dylan Holloway and Ryan McLeod. So with that said, they went out and got 2 veterans who had pretty good track records of counting stat success. Instead, this offseason, the Oilers had to take their medicine. The previous cap issues from years past eventually came due. Now, what does this have to do with getting off to a good start, the preseason, regular season? All of this is interconnected. All of these cycles are interconnected. What happens now in these preseason games? The scores, the stats, those don't really matter. But are your young guys making progress? Are your young guys being empowered? Do they feel important? Do they see paths to more playing time? Because making those decisions now might help you get off to a slow start because you're going to go with the growing pains of young guys, but that might help you more in April or May if like Howard or Matthew Savas as well. I played 60, 70 games. I was 40 points in 70 games. I know I have more to learn, but that's not a bad first NHL season. Or are the Oilers going to tell them, good luck, throw them the flotation device in the middle of the ocean and say, help's coming, but not tell them when the help is coming? And all of this is interconnected because if you are Chris Knoblauch, you know what went wrong last year out of the gate. You know the problems that impeded your success in October and the first part of November. How do you mitigate those? How do you make sure your penalty kill is crisp out of the gate? How do you make sure your new power play, and let's not forget, they do have a new power play coach, so the structure might change, the personnel might change even slightly. How do you make your power play come out of the gate hot to supplement what might be questionable 5-on-5 scoring? These are all questions Chris Knoblauch is going to need to figure out, and that is the beauty and the challenge. Coaching is a people skill. And sometimes it's a technical skill. There are traits as a coach you need to refine and develop like anything else. I would consider coaching a trade. I would consider it a skill that you need to refine and do better, through an apprenticeship as opposed to an academic setting. And that's another conversation for another type of podcast, but you're only going to get better by doing this. Chris Knoblauch has had an off season and a half. He's had 2 off seasons now as Oilers head coach. He has been behind the bench for almost 2 full regular seasons and 2 Stanley Cup Final runs. This is where he can show his growth as a coach, and that does matter. Now, I think Chris Knoblauch is pretty good. I wouldn't put him in that John Cooper, Jim Montgomery, the guys who can win Stanley Cup tier of guys, but I think he is in the next group down. I think he's often demonstrated pretty good understanding of his players and what they need to be successful. Now it's incumbent upon him to channel what he's learned, to get a better understanding of what this specific version of the Oilers is going to need. It is always going to be challenging to get a team with turnover the way the Oilers have, especially in their forward group, off to a good start because they need to feel each other out. But that's what your preseason is for. Even if you're not rolling your real line combinations, 2 of 3 guys who are going to play together, they should be together. That is why the work starts now. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much to everyone who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. Check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night in the ramp up to the start of the NHL season. On today's Locked On NHL, Hunter Hodes and I are breaking down the top 10 centers in the NHL. I'll give you a hint who's number 1 and who's number 3. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Everyone enjoy their Thursday. See you guys real soon. And until then, let's go Oilers.